Okay, hi guys. I just want to show you something I've been working on, which is forms stuff. And what I'm trying to build is something kind of low level, which allows other like modules use this module to build more, what should I say, more specific form elements and stuff like that. Let me just show you this stuff. Because what we're seeing here is that I'm currently using the module directly. I just call it forms. So this would like be an npm package. And if we look in my main file, we see that I use that module forms, just like that. And then I have this example module where I actually insert a form. And the way I do that is that I import a form from the module. So typically this would be import form from Cerebral module forms and /form. Okay, so it would normally look like that. But what I'm doing here is that I'm just creating a wrapper for putting some form data into my state store. And what I'm defining here are fields. So I have a name field, and that name field has a value of empty string. And then I have an email field, which has an empty value, and it has some validations. So the validation rule which runs on this field is it checks if it's an email. And this is actually from Forms in React. And I've been turning my head understanding forms and all the different states they can have. And it's incredibly difficult. But one thing that was really nice about Formsy is that you could define validation rules just like this. So you could say is email, is length, and then 3, for example. And you could even have like dates. So if I had a different field here, I could say is after before date. So not before date, but start date, for example. So if I had like a start date field in this form, it would check if this value was after that date. So it's a really powerful way to express validation rules. And then we have the error message. So if this field becomes invalid, it will display this error message. And then we have age, and here we have a value of 10, and then we have some options. So this indicates that this is a dropdown. So it's using a select. But the point is that you can add whatever properties you want to this. There's just some specific properties, just like a component, like you have a specific value property, but you can attach whatever you want really. And that's also the case for these field properties. And then we have a field called isAwesome, and then we have username. And username is a bit different. As we can see, we have is validating and is validated. So this is actually asynchronous validation. Okay, but all I'm doing here, I'm defining the fields, I'm defining their values and their validation rules and whatever other properties related to the field. And then we can take a look at how this is used. So if I go into this component here, let's look at this input first. So what I've done is that I have wrapped, like I have created some wrappers for the default form elements. So this is just an input. We can take a look at it actually. Let's see, input. So it's just a normal input, but it attaches the on change and all that stuff. So what I mean to say here is that this is just a normal input. The only job it has is to synchronize the value of the input with the state store, and specifically to the path the form field path you pass into it. So that's all it does. And by default, it will also run any validation rules defined on that field inside your state store. So let's take a quick look on how that looks. So if I go into, so just want to mention that, like in your application using this module, you would just add the name field as a form here, and then you would use this input and point to the path. That's all you do. And as I'm changing this now, we can see that this module is doing its work. So what it's doing here is that it's touching the field. So now it says that the name has been touched. Then we update the value, and then we actually set a property called hasValue. And this is important when you want to have, like, you want to check if it's a valid, like if it depends actually what is hasValue. Like with a normal input, that means when there's an empty string, that means there is no value. So if I remove here, we can see that when it's empty, it says that there is no value there. But then we have, so for example, if you wanted to have a required indication, and this is also a thing with forms, like people confuse required with validation. Required isn't validation. And what I mean is that if this field does not have a value, we want to set it to be required, for example, like a yellow border or something. But as soon as I type something, then the validation starts, because now I actually have some value inside it that I want to validate. And then we have have touched on top of that again. So I want to differ if the field is being touched, if it has a value or not, or if it has a value, I want to validate that value. So it's crazy complex to do forms. But as we can see here, we do all these updates, and then we figure out if we should actually do some validation or not. So you can pass a property to this input. You can say prevent validation, and when I refresh and we try again, then it jumps to no. So it doesn't do any validation at all. Okay, so that is just a typical input, but now we talked about this concept of touching, updating, checking if there is a value, and then actually doing the validation. So the next one looks like this, and it just points to the path, and it's inside the module that we define what kind of validations and stuff this value or this field should have. Oops. So what we see here is that we basically just point to the path again, and I also do a little check here. So on the email, I check if it has been touched and if it's not valid. So if there is a change, like now there's no, I haven't done anything yet, so there's no indication here. But as soon as I type something, it will say it's not a valid email. But if I go back again now, it still states that it's not a valid email. And that is because we differentiate if it's been touched or not, which is important for form validation. But if I put, like, I don't know what is it in English, like the email sign? I don't know, character. Anyways, then it's valid, and now it's not valid. Okay, so that's also something to think about in validation. And then we have this dropdown. And what we can see here is that I'm just pointing to a select, which is part of this. We're just wrapping a select, and it's using the options from here to list whatever's in that dropdown. And as I do changes here to 20, we can see that it triggers a signal. and it does the changes and validation and all that. It doesn't really need to validate anything, as you can't really go wrong here. But you might want to validate. You might have some crazy rule where you were like creating a game or something, where you had to choose a specific value or something. So you can do that. Okay, and then we have a checkbox. As we can see again, if it has no value when it's unchecked, but when it's checked, it actually has a value. We're just changing it from false to true, and we could even do validation on this stuff somehow. I don't know. Can you do validation on checkboxes? Maybe not. Anyways, but the thing is that up here we had an empty value, like an empty string indicated that the input has no value. But the checkbox, you don't have strings there, you have true and false. So having no value is false. So this is also different, like having no value is different from the type of element. And this is something you have to take care of to indicate if something is required or not correctly. And you might create your own type of element that has nothing to do with inputs and all this stuff. And you also there have to find a way to indicate that it has a value. For example, maybe you want to require, like you have a list of something, and you have to choose at least 3 things in that list. Then you could write a rule that requires you to have, like the value might be an array, and that array has to have a length of 3. If it's so the checking of it having a value uses a rule that checks if the value has a length of 3. It sounds crazy, but this is the kind of stuff we have to take care of in form validation. It's crazy complex. And you can do that here. So for example, if I had like minimum 3 list, I could create that, and the value could be an empty array, and I would of course have to create a component for handling this. But the value is an empty array, and then I could say is value, it should run length 3. Okay, so as long as and then I of course would have to create this length rule in my form. Maybe we should give that as a default rule, but let's say it isn't a rule. Then you would go in here and you would say rules and length, and then you would create a function for that, doing that thing. And then as long as there's less than 3, maybe it should be min length 3 or something. The point is that now we have defined what it means to have a value on this field. And the way to have a value on this field, so it means that you have met the requirements, like it's met the require, that is done with this rule. Okay, maybe I'm just making things really confusing, but I promise you, for a really good form library, you have to think about all this stuff, or you won't be able to solve all the scenarios. Okay, let's see, let's go back to this last one here. Okay, so now we have username, and username is asynchronous. Now the thing about asynchronicity is that we should not deliver that as part of the form library itself, because it's like impossible to handle that generically, and you shouldn't do that, and we don't have to when we use Cerebral, because what I'm doing here is that I'm reusing the input and I'm not running any validation on it. But what I am doing is that I'm running my own signal, my own application signal. Like asynchronous validation is always app specific. Like you want to ask a specific endpoint, send some data, you have different responses. It's never generic enough to have like a rule for it. So what I'm doing here, I'm firing off my own specific app-specific signal, which will take the current username inside the input and pass it to the server, where it will be validated. And now I'm just faking it, so I'm flipping it from true to false every time I do a validation. And what I'm doing inside that signal is that, as I said, I'm grabbing the name and I'm passing it to the server. But I'm also flipping some other properties on this field. I'm flipping the properties of is it validating and has it been validated. So based on that, as we can see here, I'm setting different messages. So this field username has a property of is validating, which means it's talking to the server. And we can check if it has been validated. And if it has been validated and it is valid, we show valid username, and the opposite. So if we go here now and I write the username and then I blur it, it talks to the server and it says not valid username. And again, we can see everything happening inside the signal here, but let me try again and blur it, and now it's valid. As I said, it just flips the response. Okay, so what's really interesting now is that, as you can see, I cannot click the submit button. So what I've done here on the button is that I'm saying if it's not valid, and if it's not valid and it's not validating, then it should be disabled. Which means that if it's valid and it's not validating, oh my god, all this stuff. Is this right? Disable if not is valid and not. Is that right? If it's not valid, then it's disabled. Or it should be like this. If it's not valid or it is validating. That's how it should be. Okay. Oh my god. Forms are crazy. Anyways, I can check again. But the point here is that let's make this form valid. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to make this valid. And as we can see, it's not ready to be submitted yet because the username is not valid. But if I do it again, and then we see the submit button opened up. But if I change up here or down here, like making it invalid, then it's locked again. And the way this works is valid and is validating is that I'm just using a couple of helpers here. And what they're doing is they take the form and they just go through the fields and they check to see if everything is valid. And in this case, it checks to see if any of the fields has an is validating property set to true. So it's very easy to check different conditions in the form using these helpers. And these helpers are also extracted from this forms module. And as I said, this is kind of low level. So they just have the core elements. They just wrap the core form elements to make it easy to synchronize their values to the state store and do validations and stuff. But everything is based on stuff inside Cerebral. You almost do nothing in the components themselves because they should be really, really dumb. And yes, and as I said, you can change whatever you want in the state store. There's nothing hidden here, and that's also something I think is so great about Cerebral, is that, okay, if you use this module and you use it in your application, you can see everything that is being changed in your state store. And if you want to manipulate this for some reason, you can just go in and do it. there's no hidden secrets here. You can see all the signals running, you can see all the actions, what is being saved in the state store, and all that good stuff. Okay, I hope this gave some insight into the complexity of handling state in forms, and that I think this could be a really good base module for handling forms. So what you could do is, for example, if we had a UI library, we could have a UI input something, and there you could, again, just point to the path. You can also use dot notation here. Okay. Just the path, and this UI input would automatically display the error messages and all that stuff. So you don't have to do it yourself, but at any time you can do it. That's the point. It's very easy to do it because you have access to all the state. It's not hidden inside some form library. You can just grab it from the state store. But we can just abstract and abstract and abstract on top of this to make it super easy to do form validations. And as I said, you still have the possibility to fire off your own signals, do asynchronous validation and all. Okay, you're probably tired of listening to me. So I hope it made sense, and I will probably talk more about this. Okay, bye guys.